Many, many years ago, a rich merchant in Baghdad sent his servant to the market. The servant came back white-faced and trembling. He told his master that in the marketplace, he was jostled by a woman in the crowd, and when he looked at her, he saw that that woman was Death. She made a threatening gesture towards him. He ran back to his master and begged him for a horse, begged to borrow a horse so that he could ride to Samarra, so that Death could not find him. The master gave him a horse, and the servant went off as fast as he could. The merchant went to the market, where he saw Death among the crowd. He went up to her and asked why she had threatened his servant. She said, "I didn't threaten him. It was not a threatening gesture. It was a moment of surprise." Death was astonished to see the servant in Baghdad because she had an appointment with him that very night in Samarra. This is William Somerset Maugham's retelling of a Babylonian fable, which inspired the book Appointment in Samarra. And in this movie, Boris Karloff recites this passage more or less in one long, tense take. This is his last and Peter Bogdanovich's first movie, Targets. His name isn't anywhere in the credits for the movie, but Roger Corman is the guy who made it all happen. Wherever Roger Corman goes, there are sure to be a few diehard cult horror fans to follow. So hello, if you're one of them. This is far from your typical Roger Corman film and far from your typical Boris Karloff film, but the way that it plays off of some of those typical films might make Targets a hit for horror fans or for cinephiles in general. Let me take a minute to tell you what the movie is about, something I usually skip over in my reviews. In some ways, this is a cross between In Cold Blood and Sunset Boulevard. In Cold Boulevard, in Sunset Blood. It has two parallel stories, one about a murderer loosely inspired by Charles Whitman and the 1965 101 highway sniper. These were two different murderers, serial killers, who carried out mass shootings before it was cool, I guess. I am a little bit suspicious of the modern true crime industry, but if you're into that kind of thing, you can check out their chilling Wikipedia pages. One of the storylines is about this murderer. Bobby Thompson is his name. The other storyline follows Boris Karloff's character, Byron Orlock. Byron Orlock is an aging film star who is on the verge of retiring after a career full of horror movies. In other words, Boris Karloff plays himself. Byron Orlock, Boris Karloff, seems pretty similar. Orlock is the name of the bad guy in Nosferatu, by the way. That was played by Max Schreck. There's also a young, up-and-coming director in this segment, the person who was going to make Orlock's next movie. His name is Sammy Michaels. This is probably a nod to Bogdanovich's friend, Samuel Fuller, middle name Michaels. Samuel Fuller helped out with the script of this movie and was a friend. I've seen a couple of Samuel Fuller movies, Shock Corridor and White Dog, maybe some others, and in my opinion, Samuel Fuller is not underrated. Anyway, these two stories make an interesting parallel. The film climaxes at a drive-in movie theater where, as if by fate, the two characters are united. Targets is not set in Baghdad, it's set in Los Angeles, which is a city in modern-day Iraq. Still, it's no mystery why the parable I started with is included. Both of these characters start the film not far at all from death. They may or may not actually die by the time the movie ends. Don't worry, it's not a spoiler. But in some sense, their life, even at the beginning, is already over. They have both become deeply disillusioned, I guess. Some of the parallels between the stories are obvious. Some of them are a little trickier, a little harder to grasp. Hopefully, I can dig up a few more interesting things about this movie. Before we get too far down the road, let me talk about the style of the film a little bit. There's no music. We get some interesting late 60s jarring modernist style, like the beginning of the movie has some very rapid cuts, and then you get to watch a bit of a movie. There's film within film in this movie, without a doubt, big piece of it. The pace of the movie isn't actually that stirring, despite some jarring cuts at the beginning and some sort of late 60s style. The movie takes its time in a lot of places. This isn't quite the Bogdanovich of the 1970s, but it foreshadows that guy. And let's face it, it was only a few years before he would make something like The Last Picture Show, my favorite Peter Bogdanovich movie. This film targets his first cheaply made. That doesn't show at all in the cinematography. Looks like $1 million, possibly more. $1 million adjusted for inflation, I guess. There are a lot of really fluid tracking shots in the film. You wonder what cool handheld gimbal they were using. The budget does show a little bit in the acting, I guess, which at times isn't really very good, but it doesn't undermine the movie as much as you might expect. This movie is kind of tied up in 1950s stuff and in Hollywood, so it's not an irrecoverable problem when something is a bit over the top. Kind of takes place in a parallel reality in some ways. Earlier, I guess I compared this movie to In Cold Blood, which is a cold and documentarian movie. I have a review about it. And at times, we get something similar here. Like I said, there's no music. We've got a lot of location shooting, and there's a certain uninterrupted temporality. Bogdanovich takes his time at certain times. He lets scenes breathe. He lets us just see characters go through very simple sort of daily processes. There's the slightest feeling of voyeurism in the way the movie is filmed, I guess. So in some ways, like something documentarian, like In Cold Blood, but at other times, it's something much more embellished, like I was just mentioning. These moments of embellishment usually feel like they're hinting at some sort of social comment, maybe about the 1950s or about Hollywood. One unmistakable advantage is the house that Bobby Thompson lives in with his family. He lives there with his parents and his wife. I guess what could be more American than that? He calls his dad Sir, which to me, that's a huge red flag. But I'm no mass murderer, so you never know. This family home is a shrine to the 1950s. There's an interesting shot where we take a tour of their carpet. It's 1950s carpet. One of the main things I remember about going to visit my grandparents was their carpet. That was sort of 1970s shag carpet. This is not exactly, but a carpet tour, interesting stuff. There's a bunch of turquoise all over this house. In the kitchen, there's a roll of turquoise paper towels. Partly, things might look like this because it was a hastily erected set. In fact, Byron Orlock's hotel room was shot on the same stage, on the same set, with different paint on the walls and some different furniture. Both of these locations, they feel a little bit surreal. So like I said, some of the parts of the movie are very cold and documentarian. Other parts, kind of the opposite. The tone of this movie defies expectations. It's hard to put targets into a box. This movie, to me, felt fresh. I've mentioned already the interesting personnel, a little bit of interesting style. It's got a storyline that you wouldn't have found in too many other Hollywood movies at the time. And beyond that, there are, I guess more generally, some interesting narrative constructs in the movie. I mentioned that there's two parallel threads, for instance. Originally, maybe they weren't going to be quite as parallel. Boris Karloff's part was supposed to be smaller. He had 2 days left on his contract with Corman, I guess. And that fact, that contract was kind of the genesis of this movie. When Karloff saw the script, he liked it so much that he worked for 5 days. They filmed this movie pretty quickly. 5 days isn't much, but he still sort of accounts for half the weight of the film. Karloff does a good job. He really sells the old man thing, probably because he was an old man. He walked with a cane, and his legs have a sinister bow to them that would almost befit one of his characters. Boris Karloff was about 80 years old when they were making this movie, and he died when he was 81, year after the movie came out. The first time I ever heard Boris Karloff speak, not in this movie, but several years ago, I was surprised by his accent. I had thought of him in the same category as Bela Lugosi or Max Schreck. There's a rumor that Bela Lugosi didn't even speak English when he made Dracula. That's probably not true, but his career was limited by his Hungarian accent. I guess it was in some ways also part of his persona and his character, but he struggled with it at times. Boris Karloff didn't have that problem because he was British. I didn't know that at first, but there you go. Probably the second most sinister Englishman named Boris. Byron Orlock is maybe a slightly one-dimensional character, a grumpy old man, I guess you would say, could remind you a bit of Abe Vigoda. But he has his moments to shine, like in the monologue I mentioned at the very beginning. And it is an endearing performance in a way. There's a level of sincerity about it that might excite you if you're used to some of his other movies or something like that. There's a sense of, oh, this is the real guy. This movie has kind of this, it has this construct of showing us the real person, right? Because in contrast to all the films within the film, this is the actor who is in them. I think you get the idea. And that's sort of interesting. So there's a feeling of sincerity that's nice. And it ends up being sort of an endearing role, but it is maybe a bit one-dimensional. Anyway, what I was getting at here is that the relationship between these two parallel tracks makes for a cool narrative device. The movie jumps between the two stories at choice moments. At times, it might seem like there is some pointed connection between the two stories, like there's a reason why we're going from one to the other. That's kind of what you're going to expect when there's parallelism in film like that there's some kind of comparison or that things will converge or something like that. They don't make it too obvious in this movie, and this is another way that the film tends to squirm away from your expectations, is that the relationship between these two characters is kind of weird. I mean, even on a very high level, you might sort of see this, given that Byron Orlock is sort of a sympathetic character, mainly a sympathetic character. He snaps at people now and then, but you want to feel for him, I guess. Whereas this other guy is a killer. So you can see even at the highest level, this is there's a little bit of backspin on this structure, which makes the movie kind of fun, I think. That's one of the things that makes it defy expectations. This movie, I think, also has a little bit of a meta-narrative to it. There's something else going on when you watch it, maybe a little different from the average movie. For instance, you know from pretty early on that something isn't quite right for Bobby Thompson. It seems like he's going to crack or do something erratic. I guess if you knew nothing about the movie, you might not realize exactly what's going to happen. But you know something is going to go wrong, and it almost goes wrong about 5 times. He almost shoots somebody or almost kills somebody, almost lashes out a whole bunch of times earlier throughout the movie, even in the very beginning. You first meet him looking down the sight of a sniper rifle. I guess this could sound like a realistic depiction of an indecisive person, somebody who's going back and forth, somebody who's on the verge of doing something rash. But to me, I think it's a bit different. I think it's more like Bogdanovich playing a game with the audience. This movie has a certain inevitability to it. You know, kind of, that Thompson and Orlock are going to cross paths. And because you know this, you find yourself making calculations while you're watching the movie. Wait a minute. If he does this, then how is this going to happen later? Well, hold on. If he does this, isn't that going to change that or whatever? There's kind of one level of self-reference in this movie that is obvious. You know, I've talked about this already. Film within a film. Boris Karloff plays himself. He watches his old movies. In this movie, there's another level of cinematic awareness that might be a little more subtle, and that's what happens when you watch this movie. Because like I said, it's not quite the same as your average movie. There's a bit of a meta-narrative. It's almost like a campy angle to the film. Camp, I guess, is another type of meta-narrative where you're watching the movie. There's a particular relationship between you and the movie as you're watching. You know what I mean? There's something to be seen between the lines or something like that. There's a different way that you participate in the movie, different patterns of viewership, right? Interestingly, Byron Orlock laments his cult following in this movie. He isn't a fan of camp at all. This movie, in some ways, feels more serious. In some ways, it feels more authentic. It feels like the real guy, yet it has a cult following of its own. We should probably talk a little bit about guns. Some people will tell you that this is a story about gun control, or the lack of it. I don't think that's the most interesting way to think about the movie. The film was partly marketed this way, I believe, but it would be hard. It's hard to overlook guns and their mechanics and their acquisition in this movie. It's a huge part of the film. It's conspicuous. Obviously, lots of movies have guns in them, and it is common, really, for a plot to hinge on a firearm. But it's not so common to see the same kind of details that you have here. We see Bobby Thompson buying guns at the gun store. It's the same place where his dad shops. These are very frank scenes. And again, the pacing of the movie is really significant. We see all the details. We see him buying bullets. We see him paying the bill, writing the check. We see all the little minutia of how these transactions go down. Bobby amasses a huge collection of weapons, a collection that seems far too big to be practical. And indeed, he ends up with too many to even carry them. He keeps leaving them behind. There's, on one level, I guess, a fetishistic angle here, which is interesting. There's something else that's given kind of a similar treatment in some ways. When we go to the drive-in at the end, we again see all the little details of the business. We see the lights coming on. We see the projectionist setting up the machine. And this feels like one of the central parallels in the movie. On the one hand, there's the link between the two characters. Maybe they're disillusioned. Maybe there's something in between, in common in their mentality somehow. But there's also a link that sort of grows between cinema and violence. We've talked about on the channel before how cameras and guns have some of the same vocabulary. You shoot people with both of them. I'm going to mention a minor spoiler here. One of the film's most memorable scenes shows Bobby climbing up on top of a big chemical tank beside the highway. He brings a sniper rifle, and then he shoots at the cars as they go by. Like I said, inspired by this 1965 101 shooting. Bogdanovich didn't have any permits to film this scene, so they did it in secrets. They stuck actors in alongside the real traffic, and they shot with a telephoto lens. In some ways, it's not that different from the sight, the telescopic sight of the sniper rifle. They tucked the camera away out of sight, just like Bobby Thompson was sort of out of sight, looking on with his rifle voyeuristically. So there's some kind of parallel here. And I don't know, there's a few different ways you could look at it. There's some social commentary about cinema as killing machine, in that Hollywood is part of the mainstream. There's also some more philosophical or academic theory looking at how a camera might be a killing machine, might kill the world by reproducing it, by stopping time. Honestly, my feeling is maybe more that Bogdanovich was trying to be a bit different, trying to be a bit of an iconoclast. Hence, you make your debut film about how seeing a movie could kill you, And when you put it that way, this does actually sound like a Roger Corman film after all. So there's interesting angles here. I don't want to be too facile because the movie is fairly resistant. The movie is fairly hard to pin down, which is nice. It's one of the reasons why it feels fresh. I think Targets does fall a little bit short in terms of philosophical and psychological depth, but it definitely has some things for you to think about. And it also isn't going to ram anything down your throat. To me, the real reason to watch this is because, like I said, it feels surprisingly fresh. And these days, I think this is actually a movie that has also aged surprisingly well. It's got this sort of critique of 1950s America, this almost a satirical angle with the absurdities of the domestic situation. But also, today's urbanists, I gotta say, will like the movie because it pulls cars and highways into the mix, right? Shooting on a highway, drive-in movie theater. So 1950s America really tied to the car as well. Bobby Thompson, he's got a Mustang with a bunch of guns in the trunk. So that's sort of fitting. The movie also, though, might be more significant than ever given the amount of gun violence these days in America. And I think in some ways, the way that it handles this is pretty compelling. Now, sure, we've seen a lot of true crime films come and go. We've seen movies about mass shootings, but Target still has something that I haven't seen anywhere else. Admittedly, this may be a movie for cinephiles more than it's a movie for real people, but nonetheless, I would recommend it, especially if you have any curiosity about sort of a Boris Karloff in a more straight role. This is a cool movie. I wouldn't say it's my favorite Bogdanovich movie, but this is certainly punches way above its weight and is a great debut film. On the Tobin rating system, I think I'd put this straight down the middle, probably with a 16. Anyway, we've got a couple of really interesting movies coming up. I think next week I'll be covering what was, for years, my all-time favorite movie. I'll be revisiting after about 9 years since I watched it for the first time and see if I still like it. Then we've got a couple very interesting holiday movies coming up, end of the year wrap up, some interesting stuff to come.